Okay, great. So you have two sets of notes. We're going to be using the sets for facilitators, and I wrote it as if we were facilitating a group of students, and so that you can use it if you're facilitating a group of students and wanting to teach this material. And I also just left it in a Word document because, you know, you may want to add some things or change some things. Feel free to do that. So you have our permission, and we're just happy to share this. So take it away.
Well, one of the most frequent questions are the people in our program, the first year they ask in their spiritual direction training is, am I doing this right? I don't know if you remember back to kind of those first few months. It's like, what is this? Am I doing right? And then sometimes you'd look back and say, did I do it?
What was that spiritual direction just now?
And so the question reminds us all, I think, that spiritual direction is more of an art than a science. It's more of a journey of exploration. It's a trip, and it's about the journey less than the destination. And so if we think about it, what we're being trained to do is, it's a skill. It's a honed skill, like an artist. If you think of that, there's some skill, there's some native ability. A skill that's being shaped and honed requires time, coaching, expertise. And so a spiritual direction session is more like a journey of exploration. And though we don't follow a map, it can be helpful to have some identified what we call signposts, to know where we are in the journey, especially while we're learning, and maybe some pointers to where to head. And so we offer this not in a prescriptive way, but in a way to create a bit of a framework as we all get lost, even experienced directors. I mean, we can kind of be wondering, where are we and where do we go? And we found that these signposts can be really helpful. And it's unpacked in the book, but they help us as a director as well as a directee. Over time, we're shaping a directee to notice what to pay attention to, of what to recognize as God's presence in action, how to reflect on that experience in a way that's meaningful and personal, and then what are the invitations to respond to God's involvement in their lives. So we took these 3 R's in the book, When Faith Becomes Sight, and we've illustrated them in each of the chapters. So the book per se is not about the 3 R's. There are a lot of other topics in the book, but the 3 R's really help, I think, to guide a reader or a director or a directee into some movement that feels like it's purposeful, that it's going somewhere, that has some depth and some sense of being addressed by God.
Yeah, and you might even think of it as, it's not necessarily sequential all the time. You know, we might recognize and reflect, and then we might recognize some more and reflect and respond, and then we might come back and reflect a little bit more. So in some ways we might meander through these 3 R's, but if a new director can have in their mind, you know, okay, when I sit down with a directee, I'm going to begin by listening and trying to discern, or, you know, or recognize, where is God present and involved with this directee? And then once that seems to become clear to them and to me, then we begin to reflect. And so it just gives them those little signposts that say, okay, here's where I am on the journey. So that's how we think of it as being helpful. So let's go ahead and start with the first R, which is recognize. And we want to begin by doing some self-reflection, because obviously if we can understand maybe what gets in the way of us recognizing God's presence and action in our life, we'll be a little more attentive to how God is being present to our directees. So I want you to just take a brief minute or two and think to yourself, what have I noticed gets in the way of me recognizing the presence and involvement of God in my life? What gets in the way? So what are some things that come up for you? What do you identify with that gets in the way?
Oh, I think about, so I don't know if you're familiar with the Enneagram, but I'm the 7 and I'm in the mind and my monkey brain. I have to just, for me, I have to be like, you don't have to think all this through, Phyllis. Let yourself feel where they are, kind of engaging my senses and backing away from that.
Mm. Great example.
It's interesting you said that. I'm a 7 as well on the Enneagram.
Jeff, do not tell us that you are also a 7. Okay.
Whoa!
But along with that monkey mind, my planning, over planning, and thinking ahead of how I can be prepared.
Yeah. Yeah. So being kind of in the future rather than the present, which is where we recognize God. Yeah.
For me, a lot of it is expectation. My expectations of how I'm trying to recognize so much that sometimes I miss this over here.
Or even some of the obvious.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Trying to take it all in. Huh. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
So if we were going to answer this question, we would share this kind of illustration.
Yeah, and you've probably heard it, Phyllis and Tracy, but when we
Yeah.
grew up, and I think a few of us at least, we grew up with 3 channels that, on the television. And that's all we knew. It satisfied us. There was a 4th channel every once in a while. If you got it right, it kind of would waver and you could probably watch it a bit. And so fast forward then, we take our kids, we never had cable TV. We have 4 kids. And so they're in therapy because they never had cable TV. Or we've never taken them to Disney World
Disney
either.
World
So
either.
they need 2 therapists. Yeah. But they see cable TV for the first time, and it's just like the world opens up, and there are just thousands of channels, it feels like, for them. And so the recognizing God piece, I think, is analogous to that oftentimes our communities we're formed in, it's like there's 2 or 3 preferred channels, and they're the go-to channels, and they're legitimate channels. They're really great channels, but there's so much more. And so helping people to recognize the presence and action of God is a bit like moving over to cable, or not, I guess it'd be upgrading to the internet now, that God is endlessly creative and inventive in the way that God intersects our lives. And I think that's what we tried to do with the book, was to create some conventional and less conventional ways of noticing God.
So what we mentioned in the book is that when we're attempting to recognize God's presence in action, what we're really looking for is the ways through which God is being mediated to us. So we write on page 4, for God to be experienced, your encounter will invariably be mediated. In other words, God will come to you through something else, like a burning bush in nature, an inner quiet prompting, a dream or a vision, an evocative gospel story, a recurring theme, or through some much needed provision. The medium is not always tangible, but it is sensory. In other words, through your human senses, including your emotions, you perceive God through the experience. So we're wanting to, as spiritual directors, focus on or clue into what are the mediums through which God is showing up in this directee's life. How is God being mediated to this directee? So because God's obviously invisible for us to perceive God, we must do so through some means. And even though it's not always something tangible that we, can point to or see, it could be something intangible like a sensation, an emotion, or a spiritual sensitivity. So that's why we pay attention to language, why we pay attention to emotions or to experiences that stand out as a directee is reporting whatever it is that they want to bring to that time. So does that make some sense? So training our directors to look for the means through which God is mediating God's self to the directee.
And I think what often happens is a directee will notice something and then minimize it. I don't know if you've noticed that or experienced that yourself. Something will happen, there will be an experience, and it's almost like you turn down the volume of it. And so as directors, oftentimes be helping them recognize is, let's pause and look at this a bit and give it some weight, some validities, that kind of honoring that maybe there's more here than at first blush. And I think we all do that a bit. So when faith becomes sight, we outline several common means through which God reveals God's self to us in our directees, things like scripture, especially as we approach scripture in a more personal contemplative posture, not so much for information or doctrine or right thinking, but more as a place of engagement. Prayer, especially, I think moving from prayer as a monologue, as a list of requests, as transactional, and more in kind of a dialogue where prayer actually becomes a listening exercise as well as a sharing place. And then just imagining Jesus in the Gospels, maybe kind of validating the imagination as a way of putting oneself in the story and being addressed by Jesus in a more tangible, real way. But then we also read some less traditional means. So Beth mentioned our five senses, what we call shimmering attraction, those things that just kind of catch our, we don't know if there's anything there or not, but they kind of turn our head, and to pay attention to those places, symbols and themes, those places or events or places of nature and experience that seem like they just come over and over and over again. I've got a directee now, and she just sees hawks everywhere. And so hawks are her symbol. And then even our desires, looking within, the last place we expect to recognize the presence and an action of God, looking within our desires, our longings, and considering those as something, a place of being drawn toward God.
Yeah. I'm going to tell just a quick little story here. I was with a directee yesterday, and she was telling me a story about she and her husband were on a hike, and they stopped somewhere and were sitting on some rocks by the side of a stream, I think. And they were both being silent, just sort of soaking it all in. And all of a sudden, this little bird came and just kind of hopped up toward her and just perched itself right between her 2 feet. And she was, just shocked and kind of amazed, and, practically held her breath while the bird stayed there. And it was there for a long time, almost just taking her in. And then it flew off. And she, said to her husband, "Did you see that?" And he said, "Yeah." And then he suggested, "I think that was God paying a visit upon you." And that never occurred to her. That perhaps whether God sent that bird or God simply drew her attention to this bird simply to let her know that he was seeing her. So those are the kinds of things we're helping a directee pay attention to, so that they can recognize the ways in which God is addressing them and saying, "I see you, I'm with you." So would you add anything else to those lists? We named the ones that are a little more common or unusual. Anything that you would add to the list of phenomenon that we want to pay attention to that can be those mediums through which God addresses us?
I think you guys mentioned this in the book Dreams.
Mhm. And are you referring, Phyllis, to actually nighttime dreams?
Yeah, I think there can be a little bit of both.
Yeah.
And I can't remember if you guys really addressed the other, but sort of there can definitely be the dream, and sometimes that can be a really disturbing or just reoccurring, and talking about that. And then I think people can also, it's almost the cross between vision, and that's more of a conscious. I just
Yeah.
I just keep visualizing myself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's that's good. Mm-hmm. So visions and dreams.
I was also thinking of a few different directees where either a song
Oh,
or a movie. I've even had somewhere a particular poignant scene in a movie touched something for them.
oh yeah.
I've also used artwork, photography,
Nice.
images. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Those are wonderful uh, mediums through which, I mean, we can even offer to our directees and to help them. At the very beginning of When Faith Becomes Sight, there's a quote by William Barry, and I don't have it quite memorized, but it essentially says that for any experience to become a spiritual experience, two things need to be true. One is that God desires to reveal God's self to us. And then the second thing is that we're on the lookout for God, that we're looking for that revelation. And I loved that so much. It's really the impetus for the book we wrote, that really any experience a directee brings to the time can be a spiritual experience if they are able to open their eyes and see how God is with them. If we believe that God is in all things and all things are in God, then anything can be spiritual and be a connection with God if we open our eyes to it. That's pretty amazing.
I had an experience last night. We were watching PBS News,
Oh, yeah.
and there was a story, and I'm not going to go into the story, but it was about migrants kind of making their trek from Colombia to Panama, this dangerous journey.
It's amazing.
So I woke up this morning and was journaling and kind of writing down, I write a gratitude, kind of an interactive gratitude exercise. And so I was thankful for journalists. This journalist risked her life for 8 days to tell this story. But as I leaned in it more and more, it was like it became a place of encountering God, and God kind of began shaking me up about some things that I didn't expect to be shaken up about today. And I think it's just gotten started. There's going to be a ripple from that. And so, yeah, movies, news, books, obviously, maybe those are all some of those media kind of things, but even not to dismiss books and media, some of those conventional means, those are really powerful. That's how we communicate in our culture.
Yeah. All right. You want to add anything before we move on to the next one? Any comments or questions? Okay, great. All right. So, that's the first R.
Okay.
That's where we start. And then the second R.
Second R is reflect. You see a theme with these R's here, right? So for any experience to become a spiritual experience, we must reflect on it. And reflect, we must ponder it. We must wonder about it.
It has to register.
It has to register, but then seek to, in some ways, open it up, unlock it, mine it for other treasures here to consider. Not just, I think you can recognize something, but then not sit with it and kind of move by it. And all these treasures that are there probably go unyielded from it. So On page 4 of our book, we write this: reflection is what takes the encounter into you, allowing it to impact you, to find a place of resonance within you. It's what allows a very ordinary event in your life to become deeply personal, spiritual, and even transforming. These kinds of experiences deepen your assurance of God's nearness as they become windows through which you see the activity of the divine. And so, without the reflection, it's like we don't have the windows. We just walk by all of these amazing places of encounter with God. And we use a metaphor from Susan Phillips' book, Fierce Conversation, that I think helps us as spiritual directors. In her book, she says, if you are drilling for water, it's better to drill a 100-foot well than 100 one-foot wells. So you get the picture? If you're seriously in need of water, it's better to go deep in one place and not give up with that one place, rather than just staying on the surface all around here. And one of the most common tendencies in offering spiritual direction can be drilling 100-foot wells.
100 one-foot wells.
100 one-foot wells, thank you, yeah. And you know, a directee comes in and they've got 20 things and they're just kind of verbally like putting it all out there. And so it's real tempting to say, well, we've got to drill a little bit here, drill a little bit here, drill a little bit here. The role of a director is exercising discernment, say, I think there's some water here. Can we go back here? Even if, you know, you're 10 minutes down the road, and say, I was really drawn to this when you said that. Can you tell me more about that? So questions that help us reflect, help us drill those deeper wells. And so we often say, I mean, questions, they're kind of they're the power tools of spiritual direction. I think what we really mean by that are questions of reflection are the power tools of good spiritual direction. Questions like, can you say more about that? Or as you reflect on this experience, what stands out to you? What do you speculate God might be wanting to say to you through this?
Yeah. So again, I want to ask that question of you, and I want you to think for yourself as well as the students that you interact with or the directors you know. What gets in the way of you or your directors in training or directees? What gets in the way of reflecting on those experiences of God? What gets in the way? Feel free to go ahead and speak them out as they come to you.
It's a good question that requires reflection. I think it's at times, if that's not obvious, I might be the one that says, can I go 10 minutes later? Hey, let's go back over here.
Yeah.
And so I liked that you said that. And I mean, I have done that, but maybe I just don't recognize that immediately. Again, kind of the mind, like looking at this and this and this and like, okay, which one do we need to go back? And then especially if they just keep going,
Yeah.
just making myself stop and say, God, do we need to go back there? Even though the person's kind of still rolling down the track. Letting my own self stop and reflect.
Right. You're describing of such a common phenomenon, right? So directees come in and they might almost popcorn style bring so many different things. And sometimes none of them you don't readily identify like, oh, that's the one that I feel the Spirit leading me to press into. And so it can be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, it's the flood of words, you know, there's so much. And it can just sweep it all, you know, and it's hard sometimes to jump in.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
Yeah.
I was thinking about two things. One, and this kind of harkens back to what we've already talked about, but just discounting
Yeah.
something as worthy of need of reflection. And then the other is how much having that listening presence with you of a director helps sometimes to connect things that bring further reflection. I'm thinking of directees that might talk about two things that seemingly seem disconnected, but there's something about the two that when that's highlighted, it's a, oh, those two things really do reveal something deeper.
Yeah, they go together.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't think people are asking normal conversation questions that cause them to reflect too. It's a bit of a foreign experience to many people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we do kind of this two-way conversation in normal life, which is great, but we're probably a little bit unfamiliar with someone asking reflective questions and staying with something like they really are interested, they really care. Can we really keep talking about the same thing, or do I have to entertain you?
Yeah.
Another statement in the Fierce Conversations book that I just love is something to the effect that people long to be understood rather than interpreted. But I think you're right. You know, just in normal day-to-day conversations, it's very uncommon to ever be with someone who seems really interested in understanding you. So there's a little bit of a foreignness to kind of pausing and staying with a topic and asking more questions and drilling deeper and saying, tell me more about that. We're not used to that. It conveys, I want to understand. And while we long for that and want that, we're so unaccustomed to it, I think.
When we're being invited to talk about something about ourselves or an experience that we really don't understand yet. That we kind of, there's a bit of losing control when you're being asked questions that you don't know the answer to.
And I would say in our training, if there is one R that feels like it is the most underdeveloped, it's this one. Or it's the one that we have to remind our students the most about. Like we listen to their recordings, we ask them to record their sessions, and then we listen to a couple of their recordings. And, you know, that's generally what we notice is, like you said, Jeff, you know, directees just flooding the session with a lot of words, and then the director trying to, you know, poke at a whole bunch of different things, but never kind of staying with something and going to any depth with it. So here are some things that we would recommend that are good practices to encourage a directee to do related to this reflection, and directors for that matter. The first one is really maybe kind of obvious, but just encouraging them to stay with an experience for some time. So even saying that, hey, this feels like a really important experience, stay with it. You know, don't just move on from it. Or perhaps if you're in a subsequent session and something seems to remind you of that experience, it may be even a situation where you could say, that reminds me of when you talked about that. Just because then it invites them once again to stay with it and see what's there. So I had a directee that had this image that she had. We'd done the centering exercise and with a group of people, and she had chosen this really provocative image. And it was just a magazine, a picture from a magazine glued to some construction paper. But she kept that image, and I'll bet we talked about it on and off for 2 years.
Wow.
And I can picture the image very clearly in my mind, and I'm sure she can. And we could probably bring it up today. It's really beautiful. So staying with an experience. Secondly, encourage directees to journal. If they have an important experience, urge them to make sure, if they haven't already, to write it down. And, you know, sometimes directees are resistant to that. They don't like to journal. And so encouraging them that there's lots of forms of journaling. You don't have to write freehand. You can do bullet points. You can do mind maps. You can draw images if that's a better modality for you to kind of capture things that you're thinking.
I've got a directee. He has 6 years of journal notes on his phone.
Oh my
He's got some note, and I mean, he can find them every once in a while. He'll say, "I remember I wrote this," and somehow he finds them. And
Oh
I
my
mean,
gosh. I
that's
can't
how he
imagine.
does it. And I think he speaks them. You know, it's more kind of an audio kind of translation thing.
Oh, wow.
That's not your style.
That's not my style.
It's not my style either.
Oh, you got that. Something else is that we love to use is called the spiritual location exercise. Tracy, are you familiar with that? I thought you probably would be. If you are interested in checking this out, it's on the Fall Creek Abbey website under our contemplative resources, contemplative practices. It's a wonderful exercise to offer directees, and it's kind of like doing a scan of their life. You know, like, what are the givens of your life right now? What have you been thinking a lot about lately? What have you been feeling? What are the recurring or strongest emotions you've been feeling? So it just kind of goes through layer after layer. That's a great way to help a person reflect. Another thing we would recommend to a directee is to encourage them to retell the story or the experience to somebody else. Not only me, but who else might you tell this story to? Who could you share this with that would be an important friend to carry this with you? A daily examine. The Ignatian practice of the daily examine is a wonderful practice to help us reflect, because it gives us the chance to review a day and to remember those consolations of that day and to return to them and then reflect on them. And then finally, our examine cues. We would say those are a great resource to use for reflection, because a lot of those are a little more of the drilling down into a deeper well. And you all got your examine cues in the mail? Okay, good. So is there anything else you would add to the list that would help people reflect?
You know, so one thing I was thinking of is sometimes a creative practice and tap into, something else, whether
what comes to mind, Tracy? What kind of things
we've done collaging before in our cohort. I've also participated in something else where there were just images, like that magazine image you were talking about before, and people chose an image that stood out to them for some reason, and often, something that they weren't even necessarily aware of prior to that seemed to stand out or bubble up.
Oh, that's a great idea. I'm curious about how you do the collage, but you don't have to tell us now, but I think that would be really...
Yeah, I can tell you more about it another time.
Oh, yeah. I love that. Anything else come to mind that helps people reflect?
Music, for a lot of people, that's a big part of their spiritual life. Sometimes I have a directee, he's like, it's not listening because he takes it apart, because I need to make music. And so when he needs to reflect, that's what he does.
Nice. Good. So I appreciate it. It sounds like all three of you are comfortable using some creative means to engage directing spiritually. That's great. That's good to hear.
I also find rather than taking the sole weight of trying to figure out which thread to pull is after the first, when I get that first 10-minute flood, is to ask that we just pause for a moment and ask them, can you identify one of those pieces or one of those stories that you would like to focus on? That helps them reflect on it too sometimes. So.
That's excellent. So letting them choose the one that has the greatest weight to them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really good. It's a great practice. Yeah, very good. All right, so recognize, reflect, and then finally, the last R that we want to have in our minds is that our respond. How are we being invited to respond to God? So we're always responding to our experience of God. The question is, am I responding in the way I truly want to respond? And God is inviting me to respond. So we're always having a response to the divine presence who is communicating to us, probably all the time or often. So from the book, The Practice of Spiritual Direction, which I'm guessing you're all familiar with, by William Barry and William Connolly, they say something that I think is really profound. They write, what are the most fundamental tasks of the director? Let us propose that there are two, and that they issue from the inside. The contemplative core of prayer and of all Christian life is conscious relationship with God. The tasks are, first, helping directees pay attention to our self-revealing God. And then second, helping directees recognize their reactions and decide on their responses to this God. Isn't that good? Yeah. So if you have read part of or the beginning of When Faith Becomes Sight, in the preface, I tell the story of someone I call Rick, a directee, who the first time that he came to meet with me, once we got settled in to the space, and I asked him, Rick, what brings you here? He begins to relate to me that he's just been in this almost like spiritual funk for some time, and God really seems unresponsive and silent. And over time, as he's describing it, it's very clear that he's pretty irritated that God is being so quiet, especially during this particular time when he feels like he really needs God to show up. But as we explored this perceived silence of God and began to notice his irritation and frustration with that, he also began to express how that experience had intensified his thirst for God and had propelled him even to reach out and ask if we could meet. So there was some important spiritual movement that came out of this experience of God being silent. So his first reaction was, I'm irritated. God, you're not speaking. You're not showing up. You're not conveying what I need to hear loud enough. And then as he reflected further upon his experience, he realized, oh no. This silence is causing me to yearn for God and then to be spiritually toward God and toward receiving spiritual direction. So that would be an example of how sometimes we initially have a reaction that we want to become conscious of so that we can then say, is this how we want to respond to this experience?
So there are different flavors of responses. You might want to think of it that way. It's just not responding or not responding. There's three types of responses that we just want to introduce you to here to pay attention to. The first we describe as an unconscious reaction. Unconscious reactions are responses we have to the presence and movement of God that we're not aware that we're having. And the reactions often are visceral, they're involuntary, and it's possible that our unconscious reactions are exactly how we would want to respond and how God is desiring us to respond. But becoming aware of our response is the key.
Yeah.
I think I had one of these yesterday or the day before, just a simple little thing that happened. I was on the front porch. We have mailmen that actually come and deliver the mail to the front porch. I don't know if you are, so you have a relationship with your mailman there. So I've talked to our mailman for several months. He's newish. I said, "What's your name?" "My name's Dave." And he said, "Oh, my name's Greg." And we chatted a little bit where he lives. And, I was putting a ceiling fan in and one thing led to another. It felt like an unconscious reaction to him that I would want to have had, to have engaged with him as a human being, not this person that delivers my mail. And so we talk about every day a little bit. If I'm out there, it's like it's opened a door and the conversation, the relationship is blossoming there. So it felt like one of those unconscious reactions.
That's now
It
become
just
more
was
of a
there, like,
conscious
well, what's your
thing.
name?
Yeah. So the idea is just becoming aware of how we are responding. That's the key. But the second one is a conscious response. And those are more deliberate or intentional and volitional responses to God's presence and movement. We're aware of how we are responding, and hopefully we're responding in a way that's aligned with our true desires and God's will for us. However, we can be conscious of a response to God and at the same time be resistant to what it is that God is inviting us to consider or to do. And again, I think about a directee a couple of months ago who she's been really digging into some important family of origin trauma, really. And it's been quite painful, and it's sort of bled into her own kind of deconstruction of faith and, really questioning what she believes, because that was kind of part of the family story too. And as I was listening to her, I became very aware she has just had layer upon layer of losses in her life related to coming to terms with some of the things she experienced in her family. And so I suggested to her that I said, I wonder if you might want to write a prayer of lament for all of these losses. And immediately she said, "No, I'm not ready for that." I'm like, okay. So she was very conscious of her response. And I don't know, I think ultimately God would invite her to do that, but I also think he's very patient with her right now. So not necessarily how I would have imagined or hoped she might respond. And I think maybe God ultimately would want her to respond, but nonetheless, very conscious of that response.
So I think the third, and Beth's kind of moved into this, just naming it really clearly, would be resistant responses. And I think most of us, we hear this word being resistant negatively. And I think with directees and a relationship with God, I think we need to befriend the resistance, if you want to think of it that way, that it's actually a fertile place. It's actually an important place to be drawn to. It marks a place where God is pressing in often to our lives to talk about things that really matter. I mean, when we're resistant, it's because whatever is at stake here really matters to us. So it's a very important place. And so rather than people pretending like they're not resistant or just caving, like it doesn't matter, I think normalizing this experience of resistance can be a real gift. It's just a part of all relationships. And I even thought of this the other day. I mean, you think of it physically, our bodies have natural resistance. I mean, it's what keeps us healthy. And yet that resistance at times with autoimmune disease, they can kind of turn in on themselves, and it's almost overfunction. It's like everything becomes an enemy and the body begins to attack itself. And so I think part of the movement here is helping a person notice healthy resistance that's serving them, protecting them, keeping them safe, and what is inhibiting God's pressing in and loving invitations in their life. So anything we can do, I think it's an important word to introduce in spiritual direction at some point in a non-judgmental, non-shaming way, saying, I'm sensing some resistance here. And that's a good thing. Let's talk about, well, do you identify with that? But of entering that into some of the vocabulary. In a book that we really appreciate, Urgings of the Heart by Al and Cannon, they say that responding to God's presence in action is what completes the transformative cycle, and becoming contemplatives in action whose doing or responding flows out of a rich inner life of prayer and discernment. I think Richard Rohr is the one, or at least he gets credit for it, that the opposite of contemplation is not inaction, it's reaction. And what we mean by response here is in some ways upgrading maybe our normal ways of engaging with kind of the decisions and choices and what's ahead of us, from being reactive to one of response to the invitation of God, even when we're scared or it's leading us into an unknown, but it's an invitation of response and not reaction. And just one side note, we wouldn't want to give the impression that like every spiritual direction kind of follows this arc and ends neatly with a bow around it of this really cool
That's
response.
how all of your sessions.
Well, theirs do. Yeah, they're rock stars. But I think we put undue pressure on ourselves, as well as we dishonor the timing and kind of activity of God. Some responses are really slow and coming, and that's okay.
Yeah. And yet I think it is a really important place to eventually land, because sometimes I think we can stop short of that response and kind of things just stall out there. And so sometimes it's important to, like even our spiritual director, one of her common ways to end the time, it's always the signal that your time is up, I think. She says, well, what will you take with you when you leave here? What's important for you to take with you? So it's a bit of a response in identifying, this is what I want to take with me and continue to consider or respond to. So,
well, and at times, isn't it, there's a series of many responses. Maybe that's really what is at play. It's not like there's one major response, but it can look like the response can be, I'm going to open this to God for the first time, and I've been scared to do that, but I guess I'll open it to God now. And I guess that's not a many response.
No, that's a pretty big one. Yeah. Do you have any questions about that last R? Anything you want to contribute?
So I think I must have been thinking about that example, because I was thinking, where did I get that from? It had to be that book. And talking with a gal who was really deconstructing her faith and then really got on the journey. And then part of her job in COVID has really involved how she's kind of the person that keeps the things around this large church safe. And then she became pregnant in the middle of this. And so when I met with her, she said, there's not a lot going on with me and God right now. And I thought, I did think of that story. I was like, there's an invitation. And I just literally said, I'm wondering if there's an invitation going on there. And it was interesting because I think in the past it would have been like, wanting to go after that. Well, what changed? But I mean, she's totally focused as the first pregnancy. And that's where she go. After we talked about, that's where she wants to go. She was literally sitting in the nursery doing spiritual direction with me that she just created. And so I just said, I wonder if we can bring God into this. But that came from that story. I remember thinking that now.
Oh, wow. Huh.
The book goes on, even when we don't remember where we are.
I know. Isn't that a good
Some book
thing?
I read somewhere.
Exactly. Aw. Anything else you want to add or questions you have about that? Does this make some sense to you in terms of imagining training spiritual directors in training, this kind of framework of recognize, reflect, respond as kind of the underlayment of a spiritual direction process? Yeah.
Mhm. It does. I found it really helpful. One of the things we're trying to do is structure something that's not based on an academic model. And some of the people that really have had the vision of this want that, but they're coming out of academia. And so one of the things was we had scheduled three reflection papers through the course of the first quote semester.
Yeah.
And it was very academic in its approach. And part of what we've come to is a different way of doing it, and essentially breaking those 3 R's was in my mind. I was given the assignment of coming up with something more creative, but the first paper is really about just where are you recognizing God in the midst of this program right now? And the next one is, how are you reflect on where you are in that? And then the last question of the first half is, so what are you feeling led to, how are you feeling led to respond at this point?
Interesting. Oh, that's
So
a great idea.
Yeah, thank you. That was really helpful, those 3 R's. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I like that a lot. So I'd ask you to come if you had any kind of quasi assignments that you might give students or experiences even during your training. So I love that one. I'm gonna write that down.
We may steal that.
We might. Is that okay, Jeff? We'll be happy to give you credit.
That's great. That's great. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, let me just end with speaking of kind of some ideas for like things you could offer before they read. And Phyllis, I know you're going to be reading it in a book club setting. I don't know if any of these will apply or not, but I suppose they could. But the one that we have assigned, so we always have generally 3 books that our students read, 2 whole books and then a portion of a 3rd book.
For each intensive.
For each intensive, and we have 5 intensives in a 9-month period every other month. And it's 2 full days each intensive. So 10 days over the course of 9 months. But when they're assigned our book, it was to choose 1 chapter from each of the 3 parts. And they got to choose whichever one they felt most drawn to. And then we had them just respond to the pause for reflection questions. And then we have a technology that we use where they upload all of their assignments. It's called Box, kind of similar to Dropbox, but a little bit different. I don't know if you use it. And then the other part of it was just to come up with 4 to 6 questions that would help a directee recognize God's presence. But what we noticed when they uploaded their assignments was we felt like, because of the nature of the pause and reflection questions we wrote, we felt like we were kind of invited into the inner sanctum of their relationship with God. It had a quality to it that other assignments haven't had. So that was really a beautiful and more of a spiritual formation for themselves. Another suggestion, you can read these, but the second one is just, here's some questions to ask. And so both looking at the angle of what's stood out to you personally, but then how were you instructed about spiritual direction from the book? And then the third one is based on a theme from one of the chapters. Create an imaginative contemplation that you could offer a directee during a session. And it could be guided meditation on scripture or art, or an imaginative prayer exercise. So it can involve one of those creative things that you seem very familiar and comfortable offering. And then the fourth one, and this is one of my favorites, I think it's an amazing teaching tool. We have our students write fictional verbatim dialogues, maybe just a couple pages, using the 3 R's of spiritual direction. So they would begin by writing from the directee's perspective, and they describe a directee describing an experience that they've had. And then they write the director's response. What would the directors say? What questions would they ask? What would they observe? And that would help to recognize God. And then eventually they would invite the directee to reflect on that experience. And so there would be this back and forth. And then finally how to respond. And, you can even have them, we will do this sometimes as well, say, it could be a fictional, like completely made up verbatim dialogue, or it could be loosely based on an experience that you've had that you would like to process. And it's interesting because it really trains us, like, okay, if a directee said this, what would I ask them? What would I pay attention to and note and observe? So that's been really fun. And sometimes what we've done with these is we'll do role plays. And so they'll be the director and somebody else will be the directee, and they'll read it out loud. And then the rest of the cohort will engage with it and make observations about the verbatim.
And sometimes we'll do it with a topic, not just the 3 R's, but it might be a dark night. A directee's going through a dark night experience, and how would you?
Well, we also did it on transference and counter-transference, and so they had fun with that.
We do have a little fun with it. Yeah, that is true.
They really got going on that one.
Yeah.
So those are just some suggestions from our perspective. Is there anything else you all that comes to your mind, ways in which you might engage your students? Well, great. Any other questions that you would have for us? Okay.
Very good.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Great to be with you,
So
Jeff. Good to meet
good.
you, and
Yeah.
Phyllis and Tracy. Great to see you guys again.
So thank you so much for this.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Well, always feel free to reach out to us. You can always contact us through our website at fallcreekabbey.org. And if you have questions or want to do a follow-up conversation, we'd love to have that. And come and visit us sometime.
Hopefully soon, right?
Yes.
Phyllis is going to come. I know Phyllis is going to come sometime.
Phyllis is going to come
just
sometime.
know it.
When Dayton does the big hamvention.
That's right.
Mhm.
Well, hopefully, right now we aren't having overnight guests until we feel like
Yeah. That's going to go away by then, right?
Okay, I hope
It's
so.
gonna
Let's
so.
pray. Let's pray. So, all right. Well, bless you all. It's been a real
You.
treat to
Yeah,
be
big
with
bless
you. We really
Take good
enjoyed
care.
it. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Mhm.
All righty.
Bye.
Bye.